in about 30 seconds. So if you want to grab any last minute items, now is the time to do so. Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for taking the time to join us this evening for the City of Kingston's online engagement session for the 2021 city budgets. My name is Julie Lee Stitt and I'm a corporate communications officer at the city, and I will be moderating this online engagement. 28 individuals have RSVP'd for tonight's session, and they continue to filter in. So just a few housekeeping items. This evening's session is live streamed to the City of Kingston's YouTube channel. It is recorded, and as you will have noted, it is also live closed captioned. To protect your privacy and the privacy of all participants, your video and your audio has been turned off, and the chat functionality has also been turned off. So technology, sometimes we know that troubles can happen. There are a list of common challenges as well as solutions listed on our online engagement platform, which you can access at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca. If your internet connection goes down, you can call into the meeting at the number on the screen. Now, I do suggest that you write it down just in case, as well as note the webinar ID. It's good to have it handy. This information will also be provided to you when you RSVP'd for this evening's session, so you could always go back to your email inbox and check for it there. Also, this evening's session is live streamed on the City of Kingston YouTube channel. So again, if all else fails, you might go there. And of course, you could always go and visit the channel after this evening and find tonight's session recorded and available there. The chat tool will be reserved for helping you troubleshoot any technology problems that you may encounter. We will help out to the best of our ability, but sometimes the best option is to just close Zoom and relaunch it. You can, if you have the comfort level with the Zoom platform, you do have the option to adjust your view settings so that you can see both the presentation and the presenters at the same time, which can be a nice experience. However, if you don't have the comfort level with Zoom, I suggest that you might just leave it as is. So asking questions. We do have quite a bit to get through this evening, and so we will be saving your questions for the end of the session. However, there is the Q&A tool at the bottom, which is what we're going to be leveraging this evening. So feel free to type in your question at any point during the session, but do keep in mind that we're going to be saving them to the end. It's also good to note that your name and the question will be visible to all participants. Something that we are also asking you to do whenever possible is when you're posing the question, include as much detail as you can so we can be sure that we're providing you the information that you need, that you're searching for, but also try to keep it concise because we will be reading them out during the Q&A period. We will be doing our best to get to all of the questions posed this evening. However, we do have limited time. So I just want to assure you that if there are a number of questions that for one reason or another we are unable to get to, all of the questions will be recorded in a document and responded to by staff, and this document will be posted on our public engagement project page, which again is available at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca. I also just want to take this opportunity to remind attendees that we do currently have a survey open on our Get Involved Kingston platform. It does close tomorrow at 4 p.m. So if you have not already taken the time to engage with us using that survey, please do so now, and please share it with your friends and family and colleagues. If you are joining us this evening by phone and you have a question following the presentation, you do have the option to press *6, which will trigger the raise hand function, at which point I will acknowledge you and enable your audio so that you are able to pose your question to the project team. So these are the City of Kingston guidelines for participation, which were developed with residents. Is there anything additional you would like to have added to the guidelines for this engagement session? To confirm that everyone agrees, we would ask that if you are not in agreement, please raise your hand using the raise hand function. All right, thank you. Seeing no objections to the guidelines for participation, we will proceed into tonight's online engagement session. I am going to be passing the presentation over to our Chief Financial Officer and City Treasurer, Desiree Kennedy, and Lana Foulds, who is the Director of Financial Services and our Deputy Treasurer.
Thanks, Julie Lee. And thank you, everybody. Welcome to our budget engagement session tonight. Thanks for taking time out of your evening to join us as we work through some of our Budget 101 material. Next slide, Julie Lee. The agenda tonight, we've broke down into 3 primary areas. We're going to take a look just overall at our open budget process and the approach that staff have recommended to council around this engagement, budget engagement, and the process going forward. Then we're going to look at a bit about the city budget development, some of the guiding principles and constraints, and the process that we go through in terms of developing budgets to put in front of council. And then Lana Foulds is going to start in with some detail on both the operating and the capital budgets, what makes up those budgets, and some of the elements of them in terms of the development. And then we'll finish up with some next steps. And as Julie Lee said, we'll have some time for questions and answer period at the end. Next slide. So the open budget process, council directed staff back early in the summer to bring forward an open budget process that could be implemented for the 2021 budget. So a report came back to council in July, and it presented a multi-phased budget engagement plan that was based on the city's public engagement framework, but it had a focus on 2 different elements, an informative element and a consultative engagement element. An open budget process offers citizens an opportunity to learn about the municipal budget process, and more importantly, to provide input on the priorities and to influence the allocation of public resources. So information and outreach are an essential component of the public engagement process, just to ensure that the interaction is effective and that the feedback is constructive. And that's a part of our objective of tonight's presentation, to provide you with some background information so that you can provide us back some feedback on the priorities and influence the budget allocations and the budget resources. It's important to note that the open budget process is an ongoing and iterative process. It's not something that we plan on starting and stopping each budget season. You're going to hear tonight from my colleague about the budget development process being a multi-year process, and the budget engagement process we're seeing is something similar. So for an example, feedback that we might receive today may not necessarily directly influence 2021, but it may influence future years' budgets. So it's certainly a longer term approach, and we see it as being an ongoing approach going forward. Next slide. In terms of the scope of the budget engagement, municipal budgeting process is a very broad concept, and there's many inputs that the public can benefit from, or we can benefit from public input that results in many perspectives as to what budget engagement might look like. So in terms of trying to define what that scope might be and how we would put forward the engagement process, we categorize the budget and the budget engagement process into 4 main elements. The first one is the strategic priorities investment, and that's understanding the level of support for council's priorities and the desired level of investment in those priorities. So it's the ability for the public to have input on what those priorities should be and how much we should be spending on those priorities. The second bucket, if we can call it that, is service levels. And we want to ensure that we're aligning services to citizens' preferences. So we're adjusting existing service levels, we're perhaps adding new services or new service levels in the context of obviously limited resources, and also effective service delivery. And that brings us to the third one, performance. And that's about generating ideas as to how we can further improve our services and the performance of those services. And that might be creative ideas and solutions for revenue generation, cost saving. So it's all about the efficiency of service delivery. And then finally, project specific. And this is probably the one that the community is most familiar with. It's understanding the linkage between the preferences and the investment and how to allocate fixed resources by project. And certainly a number of engagements that have happened over the past while with the city have been project specific, and the feedback from that does actually influence the budget allocations. There will be a council report going back in December that will provide council with a summary of feedback that we've received from citizens. Next slide. So I'd like to move into some of the budgeting concepts and the constraints that influence council's budget decisions. So some of the inputs that we start with. Next slide. It's important to note on this illustration on the slide in front of you that budgeting is a component of a much broader corporate planning framework. And as you can see with this illustration, the budgeting piece, which you'll see is down on the bottom right-hand corner, is really the final step in an overall planning process. And it's the step that provides the financial resources to achieve the decisions on strategies, on service levels that have been decided in the top part of the illustration. So you can see the illustration starts with the community and community engagement. And that's not just the engagement that we're doing as part of budget here tonight. It's also about other public engagement opportunities that are going to influence strategic priorities, the service levels, and then ultimately the resource allocation. So you can certainly see in the last little while some of our engagement opportunities. We had a council priorities refresh opportunity where folks had the opportunity to provide some input on an update to the council priority session. There's been an engagement more recently on the transit stations and the design features and amenities that the public would like around those transit stations, and certainly the climate leadership plan and how we're going to reach our GHG reduction targets. All of those and the input from those exercises do influence ultimately the budget and the allocation of budget. It's important to note that council's deliberations on priorities and service levels happen throughout the year, and these engagements happen throughout the year, and then are ultimately reflected in the annual budget process. So it definitely is an iterative process that continues throughout the year and throughout each year. Next slide. So one of the first primary inputs of the budget is the council's strategic priorities. You can see these on the city website. There is details on the work plans that support each of the 5 council strategic priorities, and there's progress updates on each of them that you can follow. The 4-year strategic plan that Council has approved and just most recently updated certainly guides not only decision making and policy development, but it definitely defines and guides the resource allocation as we try to fund each of those priorities and the work plans that support each of them. Next slide. Council can deliberate and approve priorities and services, but certainly not without consideration for the fiscal realities of our limited financial resources. Not unlike prioritizing our personal expenditures, our financial resources can dictate our abilities to spend what we would like to spend on. So Council's fiscal direction is set as part of the strategic planning process, and that creates the fiscal constraints that we have to consider and work within as we start to develop the budget process. And you can see the 3 circles at the bottom of the slide, the 3 parameters that are part of the fiscal direction that Council has set for us for their existing term. The first one is to minimize the tax rate increases. Council has set tax increase targets for their term. For 2021, that increase rate is a maximum of 2.4%, and it will be going down to 2.3 by 2023. The second circle is continued investment in infrastructure. Council has approved the ongoing 1% capital levy, which is part of that tax increase target, and the capital levy supports investment in our capital assets, which are important because those infrastructure assets support the programs and services. And we'll be talking a little bit about that later. The third and final fiscal direction item is the self-imposed debt limits. We will be talking a little later in the webinar about debt limits and some of the provincial thresholds around those debt limits, but Council has also approved and endorsed a self-imposed debt limit that's well below the provincial thresholds, so more to come on that. Next slide. Also influencing budget decisions are our master plans and other long-term studies. They guide the operations and they guide our respective service levels. Master plans are a long-term direction. They help us to determine the needs and the priorities of the community with respect to the services that are required. They also help to direct the development of policies and programs and the infrastructure in a fiscally responsible and sustainable manner. They are long-term perspective documents, so they support long-term planning decisions in a consistent and a proactive manner rather than relying on short-term reactive decision making. And they can help to identify priorities based on our community's needs. They ensure consideration for future demands and growth rather than just a short-term vision. They outline the resources that are required, so in that regard, supporting our budget development, and they certainly provide opportunity for public input as these master plans are developed or updated. Next slide. In terms of service levels and asset management, there's a few other things that influence our budget and the budget requirements. So first of all, we do have some legislative requirements. There are things like minimum maintenance standards that we have to abide by for roads and sidewalks and other infrastructure. We have building code requirements. We have health and safety requirements of both the public and the staff. So these are influences that need to be considered as we are developing the budget and as Council is reviewing and approving that. These are items that they need to keep an eye on. Asset management planning is also important. We need to make sure we're doing the required investment to ensure that we have the right infrastructure in place in support of the service levels that are required. And finally, this year, we've got a third item that's becoming very important in terms of our budget development process, and that's the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there certainly has been an impact on our 2020 financial position, and there was a report that you can see on the city website that went to Council September 15th that provides a lot of detail in terms of our reduced revenue challenges and some of the increased preventative costs that we've incurred in 2020. And it talks about potential gap that we have to deal with of about $9.3 million. We also are talking about going forward, looking at 2021 and some of those challenges that are going to continue into 2021, particularly around the reduced revenues as we move forward. We certainly, being in stage 3, still have some restrictions around our service levels, and we're seeing changes in things like transit usage and the ridership of transit, which is still down. And so we're having to build some of that into our projections for 2021. I can certainly just add, in terms of 2020, while we have identified a $9.3 million gap, staff are looking at funding strategies for that, and will certainly be using senior level government funding that we've received specific to the pandemic, as well as other strategies to ensure that we are funding any 2020 operating deficit that's resulted from the pandemic. Next slide. And finally, there are a few legislative requirements from the fiscal world that we do have to consider as we're working through some of our planning and budget development. In terms of balanced budgets, the municipalities are creatures of the province, and so we are subject to the legislation as it's laid out in the Municipal Act. And one of the sections in the Municipal Act does require that municipalities not only present balanced operating budgets each year, but if there is a potential deficit, that deficit has to be funded in the next year. So a little different from our provincial and federal counterparts, we are not allowed to carry forward accumulated deficits. There's also some legislation around borrowing for both operating purposes as well as long-term debt limits, which I've already mentioned. And so those are also pieces of legislation that we do have to keep an eye on as we're developing budgets. So I'm now going to turn it over to Lana Foulds. Lana's going to provide us with some information on the city's multi-year budgeting framework, and she's going to take a closer look at the components that make up both our operating and our capital budgets.
Thank you, Desiree. Next slide, please. Budgeting at the city is cyclical, with budgets being presented to council for deliberation, typically in November. The budget discussion included in this presentation centers around the municipal tax budget requirements. Utilities Kingston budgets are prepared separately and are funded through a collection of user rates for water, wastewater, gas operation, and appliance rentals separately through user fees. The city operating budget includes 4 years, the current year for budget deliberation, and 3 forecast years. Benefits of a multi-year operating budget are recognizing and understanding funding and expenditure patterns, the ability to forecast expected changes over time to funding or services, and efficiencies created in the budget process by regularly updating assumptions versus starting from scratch. The capital budget is forecast over a 15-year period, with the current year for deliberation and approval. 15-year forecasts allow staff to create coinciding funding models that can be monitored and updated. Other benefits to this approach are the ability to anticipate annual asset management financial requirements and the planning of resource allocation. Engineering and transportation services receive a multi-year capital approval to enable collaboration with other asset groups, specifically Utilities Kingston. This maximizes resources and reduces remediation and replacement of assets before the end of their useful lives. Next slide, please. The annual collection of revenues, such as taxes, are divided into 2, supporting annual operating expenditures and a portion redirected to capital reserve funds. Through the approved council strategic priorities, the total 2021 tax increase is 2.4%. 1.4% to offset operating expenditures, and 1% per capital policy to be transferred to reserve funds. Capital expenditures are then funded internally through reserve fund monies, either through a pay-as-you-go model or repayments of long-term debt issued. Next slide, please. We're now discussing the operating budget. Next slide, please. An operating budget outlines estimates for revenues and expenditures associated with the day-to-day operations of city services for the fiscal year. It also confirms what the city will spend on programs and services such as transit, garbage and recycling collection, parks, recreation programs, and road maintenance. It also allocates funding to achieve council's policy decisions and direction. Next slide, please. The city has 23 departments that provide over 80 different programs and services, not including Utilities Kingston or the 10 agencies and boards. Utilities Kingston operates the municipal utilities, water, wastewater, gas operation, and appliance rental. These utilities are funded through user rates collected, not property taxes. Utilities Kingston presents these budgets separately for council approval. The agencies and boards have separate governing bodies that request a budget allocation to council for deliberation. They provide services to the community like library, tourism marketing, accessible transit, and policing. The challenge is trying to balance the varying demands with the revenues available. Next slide, please. Billions of dollars of infrastructure and assets are managed to provide services. Roads, sidewalks, vehicles, and facilities are but a few of these assets. They must be maintained to ensure the appropriate service standards and minimize risk. Next slide, please. There are three major sources of operating revenues collected by the city. Revenues are income generated to support expenditures. The primary source collected by the city is taxation at 65% of the overall budget, 20% from the provincial and federal subsidies, and 15% from user fees and recoveries. Next slide, please. Taxation is the largest source of municipal revenue. The tax levy is based on the net tax requirement of the operating budget, the total gross budget less other revenues expected. The collection of taxes by property is determined through the assessment value methodology. This methodology allows distribution in a consistent manner. Assessment is the property value assigned by the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, known as MPAC. Assessment growth represents new construction or other additional assessment value that is added to the tax roll. Supplemental taxes are a result of new construction or property changes during the year. Assessment growth does not result in more income for the city. It does mean a reduced tax rate to existing taxpayers. In the illustration presented, it can be seen that the net tax requirement is $260 million. If an increase or decrease is made to any of the components, such as assessment growth, the offsetting change would be made to the tax levy. The net taxation requirement remaining at $260 million. Provincial and federal governments pay taxes through payment in lieu of tax calculations, known as PILs. Federal calculations are based on the assessment times a tax rate, and the provincial through a heads and beds tax levy. Next slide, please. User fees are collected according to bylaw for services and programs rendered directly. They are recoveries for services and programs that have a direct user benefit, such as transit fares, parking fees, and ice rentals. Most services are supported by some tax subsidy. This implies that the services have some portion of user and community benefit. User fees are adjusted annually by the Consumer Price Index, plus 1% for capital purposes where applicable. This ensures a consistent split proportion between the user fees and tax subsidy. Grants and subsidies are the financial support from other levels of government. The city administers programs such as the Ontario Works Income Support, Housing and Child Care Supports that transfer payments to recipients. Other subsidies are received to support long-term care, transit, and recycling, to name a few. Next slide, please. Operating expenditures are the costs expected to deliver programs, services, and manage assets. There are 5 major expenditure categories in the city's budget. Supplies, salaries, and benefits at 32% of the gross budget. Supplies, materials, and contracted services at 15%. Grants and transfers to other at 16%. Transfers to reserve funds at 19%. And agency and board transfers at 18%. Next slide, please. Salary and benefits include wages, benefits, payroll allowances, and WSIB costs for all full-time, part-time, and contract employees, including the summer student program. Most of the city's workforce are unionized and are governed by collective agreements. Collective agreements are negotiated between the city and unions and provide wage and benefit obligations for a specified term. Supplies, materials, and contracted services are costs incurred to deliver services. There are a variety of costs to support these many programs. However, some of the larger costs include fuel, utilities, insurance premiums, sand and salt, and fleet parts. External resources are budgeted to provide some portion of the services delivered. They include, to name a few, property assessment provided from MPAC, waste and recycling collection, and snow plowing and removal services. Many are mandated to be provided by an external source, such as MPAC and insurance premiums. Other services can be provided in a more cost-effective manner by external contractors because the service is specialized in nature or the city does not have the resources internally. Grants and transfers to other are linked with the grants and subsidies received from the federal and provincial governments, such as Ontario Works Income Subsidies, childcare services, and housing supports. Transfers to other are over 80% of the provincial and federal government grants and subsidies received. Transfer to reserve and reserve funds are primarily to support capital programs. The annual federal gas tax allotment is also transferred to a reserve fund for capital initiatives. There are also transfers to operating reserves to support unpredictable and unforeseen events that can arise in a fiscal year and to provide stability to an operating program. Also included in the annual gross operating expenditures are the budget requests for the 10 agencies and boards that provide services to the community. Next slide, please. Included in the budgeted tax levy is a portion for capital purposes. The purposes of this levy are to support long-term asset management, ensure sustainability of infrastructure, reduce the infrastructure deficit, and reduce the reliance on long-term debt. Funds are transferred annually to the capital reserve funds. Currently, the amount from taxes is approximately $40 million and $25 million from other sources such as user fees. These levies are increased annually by 1% of the taxation levy. Next slide, please. The capital budget. Next slide, please. A capital budget outlines the city's plans to fund and support capital assets such as buses, snowplows, buildings, streets, pathways, and other infrastructure that support the delivery of programs and services. Capital budgets include costs and related sources of funding to maintain, replace, and refurbish these kinds of assets over their useful lives. Next slide, please. Capital projects are comprised of three types: asset management, which provides funding for capital maintenance, replacement, and renewal; studies and plans; and growth, which are new assets. Capital projects support asset classes such as road and bridges, pathways, trails, and sidewalks, buildings, land and parks, transit buses and fleet, and equipment and technology. Capital projects are prioritized by the investment in existing asset management requirements and strategic priorities. Next slide, please. Capital project expenditures must have predetermined funding sources to be approved by Council. Included in the 15-year capital plans provided to Council for deliberation are the gross project expenditures for our department, with the funding summarized at the bottom. There are four primary sources of funding: reserve funds, as the pay-as-you-go approach, the grant funding from federal and provincial governments, long-term debt, and external recoveries. Desiree will now explain each of these in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Lana. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the capital funding components of the capital budget and some of the strategies that the city is using. Next slide, please. So hang in there. We're on the last section. So I want to talk a little bit about reserves and reserve funds. Besides some of the external contributions that Lana has mentioned in the forms of grants and other revenues, I want to focus primarily on two main sources for our capital funding. One is the reserves and reserve funds, our capital reserve funds, as Lana has mentioned, where we raise the funds prior to spending the capital dollars. Not unlike you would have a savings account at home that you would save some money and then buy a larger purchase like a car. Or the other funding opportunity is by issuing debt. And that's where we would borrow the funds today to spend the monies on the project and then repay those monies over the term of the debt. So in terms of reserves and reserve funds, as I said, they're monies that are set aside to address our capital funding strategies. We do have a few reserves that are used to manage unanticipated expenses and to support the city's long-term financial stability, like our working fund reserve. But the majority of the monies that are coming from the operating budget into the reserve funds are in terms of funding future capital costs. And as Lana says, we have about 40 million coming from our 1% capital levy in the operating budget, and about another 25 million that's coming from user fees to support the capital infrastructure. The importance, I think, of the 1%, you can see as we start to build up that we have about $130 million right now in our capital reserve funds. That is exclusive of our utilities capital, so that's just municipal capital. And that represents just over 1 year of our capital requirements without the utilities. Having the 1% incremental each year, we will start to build that up and we'll eventually get to a point where we'll have a sustainable balance in our capital reserve funds and be able to rely more on pay-as-you-go funding and less on the use of debt. I want to just take a couple minutes and take a step back to talk about some of the city's long-term capital funding strategies and objectives. Capital funding strategies have been developed since amalgamation. And those strategies have the objective of maximizing the use of our capital reserve funds and minimizing the use of debt over time. However, going back, if we go back to amalgamation, we had a number of years where municipalities, and not just the city of Kingston, but right across the province, municipalities had limited the amounts that they were investing into their capital assets. And so we were in a spot where we had to look at the right mix of capital funding, where we could build up our capital reserve funds, we could start to invest the levels that we needed to in our capital assets in order of trying to support our service levels, and we could adhere with some of the self-imposed debt limits that council had put in place. So the objective was, over time since amalgamation, to increase the use of pay-as-you-go funding over time. But in the early years, the use of debt to address some of the infrastructure deficits that had arisen in the short term, with a long-term strategy that we would begin to reduce our reliance on debt and increase our use of pay-as-you-go for all of our asset maintenance and renewal investments. And we'll talk a little bit more about those strategies when we move into the debt slides. Next slide, please. So in terms of long-term debt, I would like to refer you to a couple of reports that you can find on the city's website in the council meeting agendas. The first report went to council last fall, and it's a debt management plan. So anybody that's interested in going back and looking at some of our debt strategies and our debt management plan back to amalgamation, there's a lot of detail in this report that talks about amalgamation and the strategies going forward in terms of trying to address some of the infrastructure deficits that we had back then. The other report that's provided to council on an annual basis, it is a requirement under the Municipal Act, and provides information on our municipal debt limit and the limit that the province sets for us in terms of the debt that we're allowed to have. And it also provides information on an annual basis of the levels of debt that we currently have and some of our repayment strategies around those. I think it's important to note in terms of some of our funding objectives, and as we do rely less on debt, that we are approaching a point very close now where we'll only be using debt for new or growth related assets or larger capital investments where we want to spread the capital cost of an asset out over the useful life of that asset. And more importantly, that those receiving the service benefits are the people that are actually paying for the asset. So if you think of a major road construction or a bridge construction, it makes sense that that asset that's going to last for, say, up to 100 years and is going to provide a service benefit for those people that are driving over that asset for that 100 years, that those people that are getting the benefit are the ones that are paying for that asset. And so there may be a portion of that asset that's funded from current taxpayers through the pay-as-you-go, but it also makes sense that we would issue some debt so that future taxpayers are also paying a portion of the cost of that asset as they actually receive the service benefit from it. Next slide. So this illustration will show you a bit of our debt modeling and how we actually manage our debt levels within the thresholds that I've spoke about earlier. So you can see in the graph, first of all, there's a red line, which is a threshold that's going across the top. That represents the threshold that the province sets. So when they're looking at the level of debt, they set a threshold based on our repayment amounts, our actual debt charges based on our total revenues. And that's the limit up there that's been set. But you can also see a green line that's farther down. That threshold is actually the threshold that's set by council. And so councils request that we do not go over that threshold in terms of the level of debt that we have. And that threshold has been set using a number of different factors, including things like interest rates, the timing of debt and when we're going to issue it, the ability to repay, and the amounts that we're building up in our capital reserve funds, because all of our debt charges are also funded from the capital reserve funds, a portion of those. So you can see based on the blue columns that are there, that's our projected debt balances each year. So you can see by 2022 that we are reaching very close to the green line, but after that we start to come down. And that's illustrating some of the funding strategies that I recently mentioned, that as we start to reduce our reliance on debt and increase our reliance on pay-as-you-go through the capital reserve funds, you can see that our debt balances are coming down. We are currently paying about $18 million a year down on our principal payments. And I can also just mention that we have no new debt at this point projected for this term of council. So you can see that we really are starting, or will be starting, to turn a corner in terms of getting to that sustainable level of investment in our infrastructure and reducing our reliance on debt. Next slide. So the last thing that I just want to talk about briefly with respect to debt is our credit rating with Standard & Poor's. So the city currently has a credit rating of AA, and this credit rating is provided by Standard & Poor's rating agency, which is a third-party, independent party credit rating agency that provides this. This credit rating is a validation for us of our capital funding strategies and our other fiscal policies that we rely on. So it's a good way for us to validate that we do have the right policies in place, and then we've got a third party that's coming in and reviewing those. In giving us that credit rating each year, Standard & Poor's reviews a number of broad range of factors that evaluates the credit worthiness of the city and the ability of us that gives a message to investors in terms of our ability to make the payments on the debt. So they look at the strength and stability, obviously, of the economy, including the development activity, our demographic trends, and our tax assessment base. They look very closely at our management policies and our governance, including council's priorities, our senior staff composition and skill sets, our financial policies. They look at our budgetary performance, including our operating budgets, the assumptions that we use around development of those budgets, and they look at our 15-year capital expenditure and funding plans, and our tax and revenue capacity. And then finally, they take a very close look at our debt strategies. They look at the illustration that I just provided on the previous slide, our debt balances, and they look at our liquidity position and our availability of cash. So we recently received our credit rating of the AA from Standard & Poor's for 2020. And the report that comes from Standard & Poor's provided us with some information around validating our fiscal policies and approach. They note strong financial management practices that the city has and the governance of council around those financial management practices. It's also important to note the significant public sector employment that we have in the community. And Standard & Poor's notes this as certainly an advantage for us in terms of our high institutional stability, particularly in times of challenges such as the pandemic. They've also noted our moderate debt burden, despite an increasing and very aggressive capital program that we've had over the last few years. And they've noted our strong operating budgetary performance. Next slide. So just in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, we will be summarizing the public feedback. Some of the feedback and those summaries will go to our senior management team as part of the budget development, which is underway right now. And then we will be providing a council report in December, which will give council a summary of all the public feedback for their consideration prior to the deliberations. And that report will also illustrate how some of this input has been used to inform the current budget development, as well as the future projections that we'll also be putting in front of council. In terms of the timetable, we are planning to be at council late January, early February with the recommended 2021 operating and capital budgets. And back over to you, Julie Lee.
Perfect. Thank you, Desiree, and thank you, Lana. I think we can all agree. We went over a lot of information there, great information, but definitely a lot. So if you are looking to revisit this presentation, it has been posted to our project page on Get Involved Kingston. So again, you can access it at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca. This is my second time listening to the presentation, and I'm always learning something new, which is excellent. I just want to remind everyone that there is the Q&A tool at the bottom where if you have questions about any of the information that was covered this evening, I invite you to pop into the Q&A and ask your question there. A reminder that we are asking you to keep the question concise yet detailed because, again, we want to be providing you with the information that you're after. If you are joining us by phone tonight, then I would encourage you to use *6, and that will trigger the raise hand function. As a moderator, I would recognize you and enable your audio. I also just want to provide another reminder that we do have a survey opened on our Get Involved Kingston page. Just a reminder, we talk about Get Involved a lot, but this is the city's public engagement platform. So you can access it at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca, and the budget project is one of the open projects. We have a survey live. It does close tomorrow at 4 p.m. So if you have not yet taken the opportunity to complete the survey, I invite you to do so before tomorrow at 4 p.m. and to invite your friends and family to do the same. So we do have a few questions that have come in, and I am just going to pop in there. Perfect. So the first question we have is from Bruce Knox, and it is, what steps is the city taking to meaningfully engage with those who do not typically engage with city systems? And will the city work in and with marginalized and vulnerable neighborhoods to find out what their priorities are? Bruce, this is an excellent question, and I think COVID-19 has really highlighted for many of us the gaps in our systems. And I'm not sure that this is a question necessarily for our city treasurer or deputy treasurer, but it is something that at the city we are thinking about. And actually during COVID, we introduced, for instance, this online engagement tool where we could interact with people even when we couldn't be meeting in person. And that we've also looked to address the digital divide as well. So for instance, making paper copies of surveys available, but there are people who can speak to this much more informed and eloquently than I can. So I invite you, we can get you that answer. However, it's probably not a question for this evening. We do want to keep the questions focused to the budget and the budget engagement if possible. But again, thank you for that because that is something on all of our minds. And then we have a question from Carrie. If the provincial government reduces or closes programs, will the city fund the difference? For example, the provincially proposed squashing of the conservation authorities. Okay, so I'm just looking. Desiree, I see your video is on. So is this a question you would like? Oh, no, she's pointing at Lana. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Lana.
Thanks, Julie Lee. Okay, so there is a separate board for our conservation authorities. There are 11 municipalities that pay levies to that conservation authority based on what the board recommends on an annual basis. If there was a loss in the provincial funding, the conservation authority could request from the city council to increase their annual allotment. Thank you.
Perfect. And thank you for that question, Carrie. We have another question, and it is from Richard. Again, I'm going to be reading out the questions. So Richard says, thank you to everyone for your presentation. We heard about the city's limited financial resources tonight. We've also heard about COVID-19's impact of reducing revenue for the city. I understand from the City of Kingston's 2020 tax rate that vacant commercial properties, type 1C, are charged a lower property tax than occupied commercial properties, which would be type 1A. Given that this seems to be subsidized vacant commercial properties, what is the rationale for this difference in rates? Desiree, is this a question that you would like to take? Okay.
Sure. Thanks, Julie Lee. So I will attempt this one. Thanks, Richard. That's a really good question. So, and you're correct. We do have discounted tax rates for vacant commercial and industrial property. They are actually in a different tax class in that regard, and that is part of council's approved tax policy that we have those. We may have to get back to you, Richard, in terms of some of the detail around that from our tax folks around the ability for what council can actually approve in terms of those tax classes and what's required under the provincial law, because I do believe that that some of the provincial requirements are at play with some of these. In terms of some of the rationale, certainly there is some rationale around the vacant properties not using some of the services is certainly one of the factors that that plays into that. But we can certainly make sure that we add some information in terms of whether this is just a council policy or whether this is actually something that is required through the province and some of the legislation.
Perfect. Thank you, Desiree. So I just want to remind any attendees who may be joining us by phone that if you would like to ask a question, please press *6. I also just want to remind people that this presentation is available on Get Involved Kingston, which you can access at www.getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca. As I mentioned, we did cover a lot of information, so if there's any slides that you want to revisit, it's there and available for you to do so. The presentation will also be available on YouTube and Get Involved Kingston following this evening, so you can go back and rewatch if you so choose. Okay, we have another question from Bruce. Just reading through it, Bruce. Okay. So Bruce, you talked a lot about assets like roads and bridges and investments, debt and service levels, but what I didn't really hear you talk about was people and a sustainable future for us as residents. My question is, what steps is the city taking to meaningfully engage with people, especially those who do not typically engage with city systems, and will the city work in and with marginalized and vulnerable neighborhoods to find what a budget that funds people would look like? So, oh, Desiree has her hand up. I am going to pass the baton.
Thanks, Julie Lee. I was going to override you previously, and then I saw Bruce asked again, so I thought I'd wait till now. So thanks, Bruce. And I think probably there is more information, as Julie Lee said, that we can get from some of the the experts other than the financial experts in the room today. But what I can say about that, and I think I'm probably repeating a bit of what Julie Lee said in terms of some of the recent engagement that has happened with some of our vulnerable people and in the community. And I'm going to go back to referencing the slide that I had fairly early on in the presentation, where it talked about council, the community engagement, and then council's priorities, and that feeds into the budget piece. And I can tell you that is happening in today in terms of our vulnerable neighborhoods. In addition to some of the engagement that's happened because of the pandemic and some of what's been brought to light with some of our population. If you look at council's priorities, we certainly have a priority around housing and homelessness. And recently, council did an evening of update of their priorities. And I can tell you that while that was a top priority originally with the strategic plan, it continues to be at the top of the list in terms of investment. And council has reiterated the importance of that as a strategic priority. The other piece that came out of some of those discussions with council, some of the update discussions, was food security as well. And I would say that's one that actually got added on. While it was part of the original work plan that supported the strategic priorities, again, it was one that kind of came to the top of the list in terms of what else maybe we need to do around food security. So I can tell you that those pieces are going to impact the budget development this year. And council will be looking for staff to ensure that we've got an appropriate level of investment in there around that. And I would expect as we're doing that, and certainly going forward into 2021, as Julie Lee said, we'll probably continue to do additional engagement with some of our marginalized and vulnerable neighborhoods to make sure that they do have a voice and that they are impacting our budget allocations going forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Desiree. I just want to remind anyone who is joining us by phone this evening that if you do want to pose a question, you do have the option to press *6 to raise your hand, at which point I would enable your audio so you could then ask your question. Okay, so we have another question from Richard. And he starts by saying, thank you for your answer. I have another question as well. Kingston is home to a number of federal institutions, and I understand the federal government's Payment in Lieu of Taxes Act regulates how these institutions make payments to the City of Kingston in return for municipal services. What impact does this have on the city's ability to generate tax revenue, and has the city taken efforts to mitigate this? Interesting. Desiree or Lana, who wants to take on this question? Oh, Lana will take the question.
Thanks, Julie Lee. Thanks, Richard, for the question as well. So there are in the 2020 budget about $17.1 million of payment in lieu of taxes, both provincial and federal. I would say that's how we collect the taxes. So the tax collection for federal is based on assessment value provided times that tax rate. And as I said in my presentation, the provincial is based on a heads and beds, heads being student population and beds being the hospital beds, times a rate of $75 per each. That does have an impact on the tax revenue, as that hasn't increased since, I believe, 1987. I'm going to ask Desiree if she has anything further that she wanted to answer to that.
Thanks, Lana. So no, I think that was a pretty thorough answer. I think the only other thing that I can say in terms of some of the federal payments in lieu is we have had challenges in the past because one of the pieces of legislation allows the federal government to set their assessment. So it's their property assessment is not set by MPAC like ours is. The federal government actually sets their own assessment and then pays taxes based on what the applicable tax rate is. And we have actually taken steps, I'd say, over about the last 5 or 6 years to work a lot closer with the federal government. And we have a very good relationship now in working with that department of the federal government that sets some of that assessment and pays the payments in lieu. So we have a better understanding of how they're setting them. We look longer term in terms of where they may be looking to reduce so that we've got some understanding as to how they're assessing. And they also give us a heads up when they've got new buildings coming on board because they are subject to supplementary taxes like the rest of us are. So I think we've done quite a bit of work in working with them now. So in terms of our efforts to mitigate some of those challenges, I think now we've got a little more longer term view as to where these numbers are going, and we can certainly prepare in terms of some of our budget development.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Just a reminder that the Q&A tool is located at the bottom of your screen. So please, I know we covered a lot of great information this evening. I always have questions. I trust that you might have a couple too. So please do leverage the expertise we have in the room this evening. We have another question from Bruce, and I am going to read it out, and I am going to do so and just mention that all of the questions that are posed this evening will be recorded. However, at certain points, they may fall outside the scope of this present engagement. However, the fact that they were asked will be documented and included in a report to Council, as well as on our Get Involved Kingston page. So there is that record. So Bruce asks, if there are no plans to increase taxes long-term, to increase our ability to support people, is the city open to defunding certain areas to focus on a reallocation of funds in an equitable way that funds systems that address the exacerbated inequities that exist and have been highlighted by COVID-19 in Kingston? So, for example, housing and homelessness. So I believe I see I see Desiree has turned on her camera, so I trust that she wants to provide a response. So I will turn it over to you, Desiree.
Thanks, Julie Lee. I didn't think if I didn't turn my camera on, maybe I wouldn't have to answer the question. I never even thought of that. So thanks, Bruce, for that question. And I'm just smiling a bit because it's a very good question. But I'm thinking, that's council's job. So how do you allocate limited funds over a multi-number of services and departments? And that includes I think Lana said 10 agencies that we have. So I can start by answering that question by saying that in terms of our process and what we put in front of council, we work very closely with all of the agencies throughout the budget development process. They present draft budgets to us, which go into our city budget templates. They are reviewed by finance staff here, as well as our senior management team to look at what they are. We have long-term discussions with them, so they don't just give us 1 year. We actually ask them for the 4 year of operating, and where relevant, 15 years of capital, so that we are having those outlook discussions with the agencies as well as our departments. So they're treated just the same as we would a department. When the budgets go in front of council, we have our departments and our commissioners that explain the budgets and go over what's been included in them, and the agencies do the same thing. So they also have to be in front of council to explain what the priorities are, what their service levels are, and how that's translated into the budgets. So, and then I think in terms of how we then allocate those funds, council looks at that broader picture, and at the end of the day, that's part of their responsibility. There is some legislation around what council can do with the various agencies. We do have like the Police Services Act that does dictate the ability in terms of council's control over some of the budgets. So it depends on the agency that we're looking at in terms of what council is able to do in terms of getting into some of the detail. But certainly when council's looking at the overall budget, they are looking at that allocation not only across our city departments and our city services, but also those services that are provided for us by each of the agencies.
Perfect. Thank you, Desiree. And thank you, Bruce, for those excellent questions. So I just want to remind everyone in attendance that we do have a survey on Get Involved Kingston that closes tomorrow at 4 p.m. And it covers a number of areas, and we're looking for your input on them. So please do take the time to complete the survey and share it with your networks, because we do want a robust uptake. Again, if you're joining us by phone and you have a question, please press *6, and that will trigger the raise hand function, at which point we will recognize you and enable your audio. So at this point, we don't have any additional questions from attendees. So I want to provide the opportunity, if you do have a couple of questions that you want to put forward, anyone else in attendance might have something that during the presentation it provoked them and they might want to get an answer to that. I have a question and I'm going to pose it and provide you with a little time to add your questions to the queue. And just a reminder that all the questions that are posed this evening will be included in a reporting out document and posted on our Get Involved Kingston page. So we did go through quite a bit of information, and one thing that we touched on was funding sources and property taxes. And I know that property taxes account for an important piece of the municipal budget. And I'm just wondering, Desiree, this might be a question for you, but as assessments on existing properties go up, then does the city collect more revenue through that?
Thanks, Julie Lee. So that's a great question. I get that question quite a bit, actually. There is a misconception out there sometimes that when my assessment's gone up, that means the city's getting more taxes, and actually that's not the case. So as most folks know, the MPAC does a reassessment every 4 years, and for those where their assessment has gone up, that is phased in over the 4 years. So you do see an increase in your assessment each year over that 4-year assessment period. But the way that the calculations work for the property taxes, when we start to calculate what our tax rates are going to be, we start with what the tax requirement is, and you'll recall the slide that Lana showed around what makes up the total tax revenue, and one of those things is what the tax levy is. So we take that tax levy and basically divide it into the total assessed value. So you have assessment times a rate gives you the total taxes. So if you think of those 3 components, if our assessed value goes up and we have that same tax amount that we have to raise at the end of the day, that means that middle factor, the tax rate, has to go down. So as assessment goes up, tax rate goes down, the city raises the same amount. So unfortunately, we don't get the extra revenue, but what you will see if you compare year to year on your tax bill, you will see a change overall with the tax rate. And I can say for residents, if you look on I think it's usually on the back of the tax bill, it actually will give you a breakdown that will show you the change from last year to this year, and it will show you what that assessment level change has been, how that's affected your taxes overall.
Perfect, thank you. Just a reminder to everyone that this presentation is available on getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca, so you will be able to go back and view the slides again. So seeing no additional questions in the queue, we are going to move on and conclude this evening's session, but prior to your departure, please remain with us for a moment longer, because we have a poll that we would like you to complete. It is a poll that allows us to continue to improve our process. Online engagement, we've had Get Involved for a number of years. However, these these types of virtual meetings are a little bit new to us, and we are continually looking to improve how we hold them. And you are an important part of that process and a part of all these engagements. So I am going to launch. Oh, it's been launched for me, which is excellent. So please do take the time to complete the poll. Again, it's going to help us improve our process. And just a reminder that the reporting back for this engagement session will be posted on our Get Involved Kingston project page. Please do allow for a couple of weeks. As you will have heard me mention a number of times, we do have a survey that is currently open and which closes tomorrow. So the project team is going to be going through all of those responses, as well as reviewing the sessions that we had tonight and the questions that were posed and documenting them. So allow for a couple of weeks for all those findings to be posted. And I do encourage you to follow the project on Get Involved Kingston, because in doing so, then you will receive notifications so that when a new document is posted, you will be alerted and be able to go and review it. Again, I thank each and every one of you for taking the time to complete this poll. I know it's a weeknight and our weeknights are precious, so the entire project team is so grateful for you for having come to this session. I know it's from home, but it still requires a commitment, and we appreciate your time, and we appreciate you helping us improve our process. So we're just waiting on a few more to complete the poll. As we wait for those couple of individuals to complete the poll, I am going to give one final plug that our survey is open until 4 p.m. tomorrow, so Friday, November 13th. Please do take the time to complete it. It's a brief survey. I believe it's 15 questions, so taking the time to do that then helps us and shapes the work. So we're waiting on just one more individual to complete the poll. Okay, thank you everyone for attending this evening's session. On behalf of the entire project team, we appreciate you taking the time to provide your feedback, to ask us these questions, and we wish you a great evening. And again, thank you so much for attending this virtual meeting.